Our reading today is found in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 32 through 40. This is the word of Yahweh. For ask now about former ages, long before your own, ever since the day that Elohim created human beings on the earth. Ask from one end of heaven to the other, has anything so great as this ever happened, or has its like ever been heard of? Has any people ever heard the voice of Elohim speaking out of a fire, as you have heard and lived? Or has any Elohim ever attempted to go and take a nation for himself from the midst of another nation, by trials, by signs and wonders, by war, by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, and by terrifying displays of power, as Yahweh your Elohim did for you in Egypt before your very eyes? To you it was shown, so that you would acknowledge that Yahweh is the Elohim. There is no other besides him. From heaven he made you hear his voice to discipline you. On earth he showed you his great fire, while you heard his words coming out of the fire. And because he loved your ancestors, he chose their descendants after them. He brought you out of Egypt with his own presence, by his great power, driving out before you nations greater and mightier than yourselves, to bring you in, giving you their land for a possession as it is still today. So acknowledge today and take to heart that Yahweh is the Elohim in heaven above and on the earth beneath. There is no other. Keep his statutes and his commandments, which I am commanding you today for your own well-being, and that of your descendants after you, so that you may long remain in the land that Yahweh your Elohim is giving you for all time. In these verses, Moses has made the claim that God's relationship and interaction with the people of Israel was unprecedented in the history of the world. According to the dates provided to us in the First Testament scriptures, God's deliverance of the Israelites out of ancient Egypt occurred in 1446 BC. According to Moses, in all of the history which had preceded that date, for as old as the earth is, and as long as humans have lived upon it, God had never before done what he did for the people of Israel. In Moses' words, "For ask now about former ages, long before your own, ever since the day that Elohim created human beings on the earth. Ask from one end of heaven to the other, has anything so great as this ever happened, or has its like ever been heard of? Has any people ever heard the voice of Elohim speaking out of a fire, as you have heard and lived? Or has any Elohim ever attempted to go and take a nation for himself from the midst of another nation, by trials, by signs and wonders, by war, by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, and by terrifying displays of power, as Yahweh your Elohim did for you in Egypt before your very eyes?" The unspoken answer to Moses' questions is no. No Israelite living at the time Moses spoke these words had ever heard of such a thing happening at any other point in history. Moses' point, of course, was that Israel's experience was unique, unprecedented, idiosyncratic. God had done something in the midst of the history of the people of Israel that he had never before done in the midst of any nation at any time. And in the telling of the scriptures, a substantial amount of human history had preceded Israel's exodus out of Egypt. Now, 3,470 years have passed from the day that God delivered the Israelites from slavery in ancient Egypt to this day, where I'm preaching now in 2024. And according to current academic consensus, the oldest known civilization on Earth dates to somewhere around 4000 BC, though there are scholars who are now beginning to say it may be much older than that. And the oldest Homo sapien remains are said to be between 200 and 300,000 years old. Even Christians who are young Earth creationists, who would argue that these remains appear much older than they in fact are, still maintain that the Earth is between 6,000 and 10,000 years old, and that humans have lived on the earth for about that whole time. So from the most conservative estimate of 2,530 years to the most extreme estimate of 296,530 years, a lot of human history preceded the exodus of Israel from ancient Egypt, perhaps the majority of human history. And Moses has told us that what God did with the people of Israel had never before been done. Even more, we who have lived in the ensuing years can further confirm that history has not recorded this kind of national intervention on the part of God in the over 3,000 years that have followed. And so all of this is to say again that Israel's experience with God was unique. Why did God choose to intervene in the history of Israel in this unprecedented way? Well, Moses has explained God's unique intervention in the history of Israel as follows. To you it was shown so that you would acknowledge that Yahweh is the Elohim. There is no other besides him. From heaven he made you hear his voice to discipline you. On earth he showed you his great fire, while you heard his words coming out of the fire. And because he loved your ancestors, he chose their descendants after them. He brought you out of Egypt with his own presence, by his great power, driving out before you nations greater and mightier than yourselves, to bring you in, giving you their land for a possession, as it is still today. According to Moses, God did what he did in the midst of the history of Israel for 4 reasons. First, God wished to reveal to Israel that he, Yahweh, was the Elohim. The definite article is there in the Hebrew, the God, and that he was unique among the spiritual beings. Second, God wished to discipline or to educate the people of Israel. Third, God had made a covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which he intended to fulfill. Fourth, God wanted to establish them as a nation in the land of Canaan, as his unique people in the world. To fulfill these purposes, the people of Israel had to be convinced that there were and are no other gods like Yahweh. Now this may seem obvious to many followers of Jesus today, but it would not have been obvious to the Israelites in the days of Moses. Israel's contemporaries in the 15th century BC believed almost universally in the existence of non-physical beings. The ancient Egyptians worshipped a pantheon of such beings who went by names like Ra, Ammon, Ptah, Osiris, Isis, Horus, and so on. These were real beings to the ancient Egyptians, and they worshipped them as gods. The ancient nations of Akkadian and Sumeria before Egypt too had believed in non-physical beings, as did the nations of the Hittites, the Babylonians, the Persians, and the Greeks which followed thereafter. In fact, each nation-state in the Holy Land of Canaan itself worshipped a local deity, thought to be bound or devoted to the people who worshipped him or her or them. In the time of Moses, the surrounding nations believed that there were many gods. Therefore, the Israelites would have most naturally believed that Yahweh was one of a number of gods. Their temptation, then, would have been to worship Yahweh as simply the local deity of Israel, that is, a God who had taken special interest in them. And there's evidence throughout the First Testament that this is precisely how the nations who surrounded Israel throughout her history perceived Yahweh. So Israel would have found it easy to believe that Yahweh was their tribal god or their national deity, but to believe that Yahweh was the highest of all the spiritual beings, unique among them, the chief and creator of all gods, that would have been difficult for them even to comprehend, let alone believe. According to Moses, this is why Yahweh had intervened in the history of the people of Israel as he had. He had done this to reveal to them that Yahweh is the Elohim. There is no other besides him. And that was not necessarily to say that there were no other spiritual beings in creation, but it was to say that none of those spiritual beings were like Yahweh. As Genesis has told us, Yahweh is the creator of the heavens and the earth, that is, of all things physical and spiritual. And if this were true, then the Israelites would have to accept that the gods of the other nations were not in fact gods at all. They were creations of the one true God who had revealed himself to the people of Israel. Moses would later explain God's unique relationship with the people of Israel even further, when he wrote the following in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 8 through 9. When the Most High apportioned the nations, when he divided humankind, he fixed the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the gods. The Lord's own portion was his people, Jacob, his allotted share. Now the Masoretic text of the Hebrew Bible, which dates to around AD 1000, and is the text on which most English translations of the First Testament are based, says that God fixed the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the sons of Israel. However, the manuscripts of Deuteronomy found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, along with the ancient translations of the Hebrew into Greek, both of which predate the Masoretic text by over 1,000 years, demonstrate that Deuteronomy originally said something like what we see in the New Revised Standard Version. That is, that God fixed the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the gods, or perhaps more literally, according to the number of the sons of God. In commenting on this passage in his book The Unseen Realm, Dr. Michael Heiser has instructed us as follows, and this quotation is lengthy, but important. Dr. Heiser wrote the following: "So what happened to the other nations? What does it mean that they were apportioned as an inheritance according to the number of the sons of God? As odd as it sounds, the rest of the nations were placed under the authority of members of Yahweh's divine council. The other nations were assigned to lesser gods, to lesser Elohim, as a judgment from the Most High, Yahweh. That this interpretation is sound is made clear by an explicit parallel passage, Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 19 through 20. There Moses says to the Israelites, "And do this so that you do not lift your eyes toward heaven and observe the sun and the moon and the stars, all the host of the heavens, and be led astray and bow down to them and serve them, things that Yahweh your Elohim has allotted to all of the peoples under all of the heavens. But Yahweh has taken you and brought you out from the furnace of iron from Egypt to be a people of his inheritance to him, as it is this day." Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 19 through 20, Dr. Heiser continues, is the other side of God's punitive coin. Whereas in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 8 through 9, God apportioned or handed out the nations to the sons of God, here we are told God allotted the gods to those nations. God decreed in the wake of Babel that the other nations he had forsaken would have other gods beside himself to worship. It is as though God was saying, if you don't want to obey me, I'm not interested in being your God. I'll match you up with some other God. Psalm 82, where we started our divine council discussion, echoes this decision. That psalm has Yahweh judging other Elohim, sons of the Most High, for their corruption in administering the nations. The psalm ends with the psalmist pleading, "Rise up, O Elohim, judge the earth, because you shall inherit all the nations." It might seem that God's response at the Tower of Babel incident was overly severe, Dr. Heiser continues, but consider the context. The point is not that Yahweh was a glorified building inspector. As we noted in an earlier chapter, gods were perceived to live on mountains. The Tower of Babel is regarded by all scholars as one of Mesopotamia's famous man-made sacred mountains, a ziggurat. Ziggurats were divine abodes, places where Mesopotamians believed heaven and earth intersected. The nature of this structure makes evident the purpose in building it, to bring the divine down to earth. The biblical writer wastes no time in linking this act to the earlier divine transgression of Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. That passage sought to portray the giant quasi-divine Babylonian culture heroes, the Apkalus, who survived the flood, as men of renown, or more literally, men of the name. Those who built the Tower of Babel wanted to do so, to make a name for themselves. The building of the Tower of Babel meant perpetuating Babylonian religious knowledge and substituting the rule of Babel's gods for rule by Yahweh. Yahweh would have none of it. After the flood, God had commanded humanity once again to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. These words reiterated the original Edenic intention, but instead of obeying and having Yahweh be their God, the people gathered to build the tower. The theological messaging of the story is clear. Humanity had shunned Yahweh and his plan to restore Eden through them, so he would shun them and start again. While the decision was harsh, the other nations are not completely forsaken. Yahweh disinherited the nations, and in the very next chapter of Genesis he calls Abram out of, you guessed it, Mesopotamia. Again, this is not accidental. Yahweh would take a man from the heart of the rebellion and make a new nation, Israel. But in his covenant with Abram, God said that all the nations of the earth would be blessed through Abram, through his descendants. The covenant language reveals that it was God's intention, right on the heels of his decision to punish the nations, that the Israelites would serve as a conduit for their return to the true God. That's the end of the quotation. According to Moses, one of God's intentions in delivering the people of Israel from slavery in ancient Egypt was to demonstrate to them in real space and time that he was not simply another of a number of spiritual beings. God demonstrated this truth by conquering the entire pantheon of Egyptian gods by himself. This was the meaning behind each of the 10 plagues God sent upon the Egyptian people. Each plague targeted a set of gods in the Egyptian pantheon. In this way, God demonstrated to the Israelites and to the Egyptians his supremacy above all gods, which he was about to continue to evidence through Israel's conquest of the nations and gods of the Holy Land. Why did Yahweh want Israel to know that they had been chosen by the one true Creator God? As Dr. Heiser has reminded us, this was part of God's promise to Abraham when God first called him out of the ancient Sumerian city of Ur. God had promised to bless all nations on earth through Abraham and his descendants. In the words of Moses we considered in an earlier discussion found in Deuteronomy chapter 4 verses 5 through 8, "See, just as Yahweh my Elohim has charged me, I now teach you statutes and ordinances for you to observe in the land that you are about to enter and occupy. You must observe them diligently, for this will show your wisdom and discernment to the peoples, who when they hear all these statutes will say, 'Surely this great nation is a wise and discerning people.' For what other great nation has an Elohim so near to it, as Yahweh our Elohim is whenever we call to him? And what other great nation has statutes and ordinances as just as this entire law that I am setting before you today?" To put the matter more plainly, God had chosen Abraham and his descendants in order to instruct and discipline them through an intense and generational interaction with him, so that their culture might become the conduit through which God could both instruct and reclaim the nations which had fallen into the worship of the spiritual beings who God had assigned to guide and watch over them. In his book, The Mediation of Christ, British theologian T.F. Torrance has explained God's disciplining of the people of Israel throughout their history as follows. He writes, "In his God's desire to reveal himself and make himself knowable to mankind, he selected one small race out of the whole mass of humanity and subjected it to intensive interaction and dialogue with himself in such a way that he might mold and shape this people in the service of his self-revelation. Thus God established a special partnership of covenanted kinship with Israel, so that within the intimate structure of family relations, he might increasingly imprint himself upon the generations of Israel in such a way that it could become the instrument of his great purpose of revelation." A little later, a two-way movement was involved, an adaptation of divine revelation to the human mind, and an adaptation of articulate forms of human understanding and language to divine revelation. That's the end of the quotation. It was for these reasons that God needed Israel to be a nation of this earth with an established territory and government of their own. This was why God had called Abraham out of the Sumerian city of Ur, and it was why God had promised to give the Holy Land of Canaan to Abraham's descendants. What the scriptures reveal is that the other gods, that is, the other spiritual beings who were created by the one true God, to whom Yahweh had given responsibility to govern and to guide the other nations of the earth, knew Yahweh's intention for the people of Israel and for the Holy Land. The implication of the scriptures is that it was for this reason that the gods of Egypt incited their people against the Israelite people and made them slaves in a country in which they had originally been honored guests. And it was for this reason that during Israel's 4 centuries of slavery in Egypt, that the other gods had filled the Holy Land with their most powerful and proficient warriors, the descendants of the Nephilim. All of this had been to prevent Yahweh from establishing a nation upon the earth who was uniquely guided and governed by him. The enslavement of the Israelites in ancient Egypt, along with the presence of the Nephilim, Rephaim, and Anakim in the Holy Land during the lifetime of Moses and of Joshua, reveals an uncomfortable truth. Some of the spiritual beings that Yahweh had tasked with guiding and governing the nations of the earth had joined the conspiracy of the serpent from the Garden of Eden and had rebelled against him and his lordship. In the days of Moses, they were actively resisting God's intentions with the people of Israel, and for that reason, God had assaulted the Egyptians and their associated spiritual leaders, and for that reason the Israelites were going to have to displace the nations that had laid hold of the Holy Land during their absence. One might even conclude that from the perspective of the rebellious sons of God, the enslavement of Israel in Egypt was part of their plan to give them time to populate the Holy Land so that God's promises to Abraham could not be fulfilled. It is in response to these realities that Moses concluded the passage we're considering today with the following exhortations. So acknowledge today and take to heart that Yahweh is the Elohim in heaven above and on the earth beneath. There is no other. Keep his statutes and his commandments, which I am commanding you today, for your own well-being and that of your descendants after you, so that you may long remain in the land that Yahweh your Elohim is giving you for all time. It was essential that Israel did not learn to worship Yahweh, the one true God, in the ways the rebellious nations had come to worship their gods. Because Yahweh was distinct among the gods, so Israel's worship of Yahweh had to be distinct. If Israel was to be Yahweh's prophetic voice of revelation to the nations, if Israel was to be the vessel through which God would reclaim the nations which had rebelled against his lordship, if Israel was to be given the culture, the worldview, and the language which would make the word of God capable of being understood and transmitted to the nations of the earth, then Israel would have to be faithful to keep Yahweh's statutes and commandments. The New Testament reveals that all of these centuries of discipline and instruction were intended to prepare Israel for the coming of Jesus, for the coming of God himself in human flesh. Only after all those centuries of, in the words of T.F. Torrance, intensive interaction and dialogue with himself, would the Israelite people be properly molded and shaped in the service of his self-revelation. When God took on human flesh, God chose to embody himself in Israelite flesh. When God in the flesh chose to speak to the people of the earth, he chose to speak in the language of the people of Israel. When God took on human flesh, he chose Israelite men to be the bearers of his gospel and to interpret his life for the rest of the nations. When God took on human flesh, he chose to live by the statutes and commandments that he himself had given to Israel during the days of Moses. God took on Israelite flesh in the person of Jesus, in the midst of the ancient nation of Israel, living by the Torah God had given to Israel through Moses, because it was only in this context and by this people that God could be truly understood, and it was only through this people that God's gospel could be declared to the nations. This was God's work, and it was a fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham to bless all nations of the earth through his descendants. Perhaps we too should remember that God has called we even from among the Gentiles who have heard his gospel and acknowledged with Israel that Yahweh is the Elohim, there is no other besides him, to keep his statutes and his commandments. God himself has explained the purpose and spirit of these commandments through the life, teachings, ministry, death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus, the Messiah. And so we obey the Torah given to Moses through the reading and embodiment of Jesus, but still we must obey. This is our purpose and place in the world. As St. Paul the Apostle explained the responsibility of God's apostles in the early church in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 20 through 21, so we are ambassadors for Christ. Since God is making his appeal through us, we entreat you on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. For our sake he made him to be sin, who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. In the wake of the death of Jesus' apostles, this responsibility has been entrusted to the Church of Jesus, to true Israel, consisting of the root of the patriarchs, of natural branches of Israelites who have remained faithful to Yahweh and to his mission, and of Gentiles who by faith in Jesus have been grafted into the olive tree of Israel. Our mission is still obedience to God, and the bearing of faithful witness among the nations. And this will remain our mission until Jesus returns, to reclaim the leadership of all of those nations and gods who have rebelled against the authority of Yahweh and the lordship of his Messiah. May those who have ears to hear listen to what the Spirit is saying to the people of God. Amen.